Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I will be discussing the Qur'an, the first source of Sharia, looking at the meaning and definition of the Qur'an and some of the characteristic features of the Qur'an, such as the occasions of revelation, inimitability of the Qur'an, the phenomena of ratiocination or ta'leel, the definitive and speculative in the Qur'an, etc. Qur'an is a derivative of the root word qara'a, to read. Literally it means a recital, a reader. It is the most important source of Islam in its Sharia, and the proof of the prophethood of Muhammad, and it is defined as the book containing the speech of Allah revealed to the Prophet Muhammad in Arabic, transmitted to us through continuous testimony or tawatur. The Qur'an is also gives itself several other names, like Huda, guide; Furqan, a divider; Zikr, a reminder; Kitab, a book; Tanzeel, a descent, etc. It contains 114 surahs or chapters in over 6,200 verses. And the order in which the Qur'an appears, the order of the chapters and verses have been changed during the last year of the Prophet's life, and the text that we have and the final parts consist of the early revelations. And the end occurs in Surah 5. Nearly all other sources of Sharia rely on the Qur'an, as we will see in the various parts of our discussion of Usul al-Fiqh. The Qur'an was revealed in 3 stages, and this is known from the internal Qur'ānic evidence itself. The first descent was it was into Lawh al-Mahfuz, or a preserved tablet. The reference to this is in 85:21. We do not exactly know the manner of its revelation into a preserved tablet. The second instance of revelation was to the lowest heaven, and it seems from the evidence that this instance of revelation took place in one single night. Inna anzalnahu fi laylatil qadr. We revealed it in the night of Qadr. And the third instance of revelation was over a period of 23 years, the entire duration of the prophetic mission of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The text as before us begins with a short surah, Al-Fatiha, the opening, about 10 verses, but then followed by the longest chapter. Al-Baqarah is the longest chapter, stretching to 286 verses, and then the shortest chapters appears right toward the end of the Qur'an. The text is also not classified subject-wise. We read in the Surah Al-Baqarah, the second chapter, references to a variety of themes and subject, marriage and divorce and drinking liquor and ablution and Hajj and formal salat, etc., etc. And the ulama have understood this as the Qur'an itself indicates, that it is a unified whole. It is not to be split into segments. The Qur'an warns its readers not to be selective, to take some part and reject others. The Qur'an was revealed, all of it, to Prophet Muhammad in the state of wakefulness. This is called manifest revelation or wahya zahir, as opposed to wahya batin or ilham. Ilham is inspiration, which may be in state of wakefulness or in dream sequences. And in this respect, the speech of the Prophet's own sayings in hadith, is based on this second manner of revelation, that is through ilham. Some of the characteristics of the Qur'an do not apply to the sayings of the Prophet himself. Like we recite the Qur'an in salat, in formal prayer, that is not the case with regard to hadith. And the Qur'an has to be, the best way is to approach the Qur'an in a state of ablution. This is also not a requirement for reciting or reading hadith. The Qur'an is all of it in pure Arabic, although there are odd words of Greek, Persian, and Turkish in the Qur'an, but by the time of its full revelation, those segments or words have already been integrated into the Arabic language, but there is no full sentence of a foreign origin other than Arabic in the Qur'an. The question arises whether a translation of the Qur'an in another language qualifies as Qur'an. And the answer to that has been given in the negative, that it is an interpretation of the Qur'an if you translate it into Persian, because it is Allah's speech and it is in pure Arabic. Although Imam Abu Hanifa, who was himself of a Persian descent, passed an early fatwa to say that salat may be performed in Persian translation. But this was soon overruled by his own disciples in the position that we have. Yes, we may translate the Qur'an as it has been in all languages, and yet the Qur'an itself, the original, is only in Arabic. The companions of the Prophet committed the Qur'an to memory. The Prophet himself had solicited the help of scribes like Zayd bin Sabit, that he wrote the Qur'an as and when it was revealed. But it was not kept as a single one unified book until the time of the first Caliph Abu Bakr, who again employed Zayd ibn Sabit with the support of others to consolidate the text of the Qur'an. But then soon after that, because of the prevalence of various dialects among the Arabs, 7 Arabic dialects, some of the words and sentences of the Qur'an with different harakat and inclinations were read and affected the meaning of the text. It was because of this that the 4th Caliph Osman decided to authenticate the text of the Qur'an once again, with the help again of Zayd ibn Sabit and others. And then he decided to destroy all the variant versions of the Qur'an. The Qur'an that we have with us is that which has been documented, authenticated, and unified at that time, during the time of Osman. The Qur'an, as I said, was revealed in 23 years. This graduality or tanjim or tadarruj is a feature of the Qur'anic revelation, and the Qur'an itself explains it why it was revealed in that manner. It was to convey its message so that people are able to absorb the message, to strengthen their belief in the messages of Islam. And the Arab people were also illiterate, and it would have been difficult for them to digest if it were to be all revealed at once. Gradual manner of revelation also provided an opportunity for correction. Sometimes the Quran testifies that the Prophet himself as human being made mistakes, then the Quran corrected those. Similarly, abrogation is a phenomena, and naskh. Some of the very early parts of the Quran were later replaced and abrogated by others, although abrogation is a disputed subject. But nevertheless, this would not have been possible if the Quran were to be revealed all at once. Like some of the legislation concerning wine drinking, prohibition of liquor drinking, took place in 3 different stages. In which first there was some reference that there is some benefit and harm, then it was prohibited during the prayer, or salat eventually completely prohibited. This was in due regard to the prevalence of liquor. It was very widely practiced, and graduality also made that possible, to address social issues, entrenched social issues gradually. The whole of the Qur'anic text has been received by us through continuous testimony or tawatur. Characteristically, all of the Qur'an is mutawatir, and nothing less than that would qualify the text of the Qur'an. There were instances, for example, that some prominent ulama among the companions, like Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Abdullah ibn Zubair, they read segments, 1 or 2 words of the Quran slightly differently. Like Ibn Mas'ud, instead of 3 days, he read 3 consecutive days. In another place, similar small variations, but since these were not supported by tawatur, they were not taken in as part of the text of the Quran. Another characteristic feature of the revelation of the Quran is its division into 2 distinctive parts, the Makki and the Madani parts. The Makki parts were those that were revealed during the Prophet's residence in Mecca. During the first 12 and a half or 12 years and 7 months, the larger part of the Quran was revealed at that time. 85 out of 114 chapters were revealed at a time when the Muslim community was a minority, and that, of course, had some consequences. If you compare that to the Quran that was revealed in Medina after the Prophet's migration, when the Muslims became a sovereign power and established a government, and this also is manifested in the style and language of the Quran. The earlier revelation has an intensity or in its appeal, addressing entrenched issues, the matter of aqidah and belief, whereas later the text becomes more serene. The earlier parts were also concerned mainly with historical narratives of the earlier nations and their prophets, some very ugly Arab practices like infanticide, belief in Allah, matter of worship, so the halal and haram in food, in giving measurements, due measurements in weights, etc., etc. Whereas in Medina, since there was a government, then the Qur'an came, addressed issues of social significance, legal provisions concerning marriage and divorce, civil transaction, etc. These were revealed during the Prophet's mission in Medina. Certain as subjects like are typically Madinis. The reference to jihad, we know that during the Prophet's time in Mecca, jihad was not permitted. All references to this subject are Madini. There are 19 abbreviated chapters in the Qur'an, beginning with abbreviated letters. These are called al-Muqatta'at. It is known that all of them are Makki except for Surah 2 and 3, Baqarah and Al Imran. References to the hypocrites, to certain individuals like Abi Lahab, and the manner of address. In the Makki Qur'an, we often read Ya Ayyuhan Nas, O people, O mankind, whereas in Medina the address is O believers. It is through this, looking at the text of the Qur'an and other evidences, we are able to identify and divide the Makki and Madini from one another. There are three methods of dividing the Qur'an into these two parts. One is the time factor, that before the migration of the Prophet, before the Hijrah to Medina, any part of the text that was revealed before then, it is classified as Makki, and after that as Madini. This is actually the preferred method. The second method is the time, the place factor. The verses that were revealed in Makkah and its environs are Makki. Those in Medina and its surroundings are Madini. Even during Medina, the Prophet actually traveled to Makkah and to other places. In the Quran, some verses were revealed, they are still classified as Madini. And the third is through internal evidence in the Quran, subject-wise. As I said, all references to jihad, all certain other things, hypocrites, individuals, these we know that the internal evidence in the Quran also help us to distinguish the Makki from Madini. It is an important distinction. It relates to, if one were to absorb the meaning of the Quran, the legal rulings and the ahkam, it is important for us to be able to identify the Makki from the Madini. In fact, every surah of the Quran bears the description, this is Makki, this is Madini, in the written Quran as we have today. The legal part of the Quran and the Ayat al-Ahkam is only a small part. Perhaps about 3% of the Quran is concerned with practical legal matters that address to competent individuals. Even in this part, the commands and prohibitions of the Quran, the language is slightly different to that of statutory legislation. The Qur'anic language goes beyond do's and don'ts, appeal to the conscience, explaining the benefit and the harm of certain of its legal rulings, It makes the language more comprehensive. And yet the ulama are not in agreement completely over the number of the ayat al-ahkam or the legal verses of the Qur'an. The estimates range from 200 to 800. Ibn al-Arabi identified the ayat al-ahkam and numbered them at 800. Others are more strict, and it depends on the perspective and viewpoint of the researcher, whether someone is able to extract a legal ruling from a historical narrative. That is how the numbering will differ. But it is generally stated in the textbook that the legal rulings, there are about 350. Of this, the largest portion, 140, addresses the ibadat, matters of aqidah and worship, and it's about 70 verses addressing personal status, marriage, divorce, inheritance, etc. About 70 others are concerned with mu'amalat, contracts, civil transactions, so on and so forth. 30 verses occur in the subject in the context of crime and punishment. Another 30 on general principles of justice, equality, principles of government, and some norms of about 25 verses on war and peace, international relations, and about the remaining 10 or about that on economic matters. We now move on to specify some other characteristics of Qur'anic legislation. We mentioned some: Makki, Madani, graduality, and so on. Now another aspect of the Qur'anic legislation is this division into two types of qat'i and zwanni, the definitive and the speculative. A definitive text is conveyed into in self-contained language that it is explicit and conveys a clear meaning, and therefore not in need of interpretation and not even of ijtihad. As it stands, it delivers a full meaning, like some of the quantitative references in Qur'an to shares in inheritance, some punishments, and like if we read that for the husband the entitlement in the wife's share is 1/2 if they have no children. This is something that delivers a clear meaning and it's not really open to interpretation. Or the punishment of slanderous accusation is 80 lashes of the whip. We may differ on how to define slanderous accusation or how to implement the whip and to what severity or what are the composition of the whip and so on. We may differ over that, but the text itself is qat'i. The subjects also here feature that matters of dogma in aqidah and matters of worship in ibadat, the essentials of the faith, they are all conveyed in decisive qat'i language. Whereas zwanni or speculative is a text that is open to interpretation and differences in understanding. And this is also gives rise to differences in understanding in ijtihad. And the best interpretation is provided is that which of the Qur'an by the Qur'an itself. Some parts of the Qur'an interprets its other parts, and that is the most authoritative interpretation. Then next to that is when the Prophet interprets the Qur'an, the interpretation of the Qur'an by the Sunnah, and after that interpretation that is provided by the companions, as they were witnesses of the revelation and most familiar with the phenomenology of the Qur'an. A text, a speculative text, for example, when you read حُرِّمَتْ عَلَيْكُمْ أُمَّهَاتُكُمْ وَبَنَاتُكُمْ, forbidden to you in marriage are your mothers and your daughters and some other relatives. Now mothers and daughters are words that can take different meanings. Mother, it can be stepmother, real mother, foster mother, grandmother, and therefore the text is open to interpretation. Over the daughters, the meaning of daughters, the Hanafis and the Jumhur, the Shafis, differ. The Hanafis say Banatukum in the Qur'an means biological daughter, whereas the Shafis and others say no, it's daughter through marriage only, legitimate daughter. So if you apply the Hanafi in the Shafi, the illegitimate daughter, for example, will not inherit according to the Shafis. According to the Hanafis, the ruling will differ, and then whether you can marry those relatives or not, again will differ the position. And some of them are very, very consequential differences. I have given many other examples in my book, Principles of Islamic Jurisprudence, of the Zwanni segments of the Qur'an. The Qur'an may be, the text of the Qur'an may be, sometimes the same verse may convey both meaning, decisive and speculative meaning, in which case each will stand independently of the other. For example, we read with reference to ablution, وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ إِلَى, and wipe your head when you do a wudu. This is qati. Wiping of the head as part of the ablution is decisive. But how much of it? How much of the head? In what manner? This is open to interpretation. So each will deliver its own meaning. And there are times that the same segment of the Qur'an receives half a dozen interpretations, 7 or 8 types of different interpretations. Some ulama like Mahmud Shaltut says that this is the essence of flexibility, tawsi'ah, in versatility of the Qur'an, that enables us to select, not us but the ruler, the government, to select that interpretation which meets the welfare and the benefit of society best at any particular time. There is a general consensus that the khas or specific in the Qur'an is qat'i, is definitive. All the specific part of the text convey definitive meaning, but there is disagreement whether the general or am in the Qur'an, which is more than 95%, rough estimate of the Qur'an is am, whether this is speculative or definitive. Again, there are differences. The Hanafis say that the am of the Qur'an, the general in the Qur'an, is definitive. This is characteristic of all languages. Words convey their general meaning and we take it as such. Whereas the majority, the Jumhur, maintain that the general is open to interpretation, it is speculative. To give an example again earlier, forbidden to you, your mothers, your daughters, your aunts and others. Now, Ummahatukum, banatukum, they are general words. General. Your mother, your daughter. They are am. In other words, they convey different meaning, and all of the meaning are qat'i. So stepmother, grandmother, half mother, foster mother, all are haram. This is if you follow the Hanafi ruling. And the majority maintain that the am of the Qur'an is open to interpretation. Like over the meaning of daughters, there are interpretations. The speculative or Zwanni part of the Qur'an have most of it been addressed by the Sunnah of the Prophet, in failing that through the ijtihad in research of the scholars and ulama over a period of time, over centuries, and it's all been fairly well explained. We do not have gray areas of great concern, so to speak. And there is, of course, some jurisprudence formulas, specification of the general takhsis al-am, for example. The general provision is given in the Quran, the Sunnah specifies it, aspects of it, makes some exceptions to it and gives it a different qualification. Like we read, أَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَى. Allah permitted sale and prohibited usury. All sale is permitted, but not quite. The Prophet has made exceptions of the sale with uncertainty and gharar, certain varieties of sale like munabaza and haswat, you throw pebbles, and the Arabs used to do this and that becomes sold. Those were explicitly prohibited. Therefore, these aspects of the Sunnah specifies the general provisions of the Quran, and once that is given, then it is as good as qat'i. It affects the meaning. Sometimes it's the other way around. The Quran specifies the general meaning of the Sunnah. For example, the hadith of the Prophet, there are some hadiths on the subject of riba or usury, and they are all ahad, solitary hadiths, therefore they are not qat'i, they are not decisive. But since the Quran has made very clear ruling on the prohibition of riba, it raises the speculative to the level of definitive. Another manner of raising the Zwanni to qat'i level is through consensus, definitive ijma. But sometimes the khas or specific provisions of the Quran, it may be open to some level of interpretation, but generally it's not encouraged. For example, the expiation for a false oath, for an oath that is broken, is to feed 10 poor persons. The Hanafi says 10 poor person is specific and it is qat'i. But they say, well, if you cannot find 10 poor person, feed the same one person 10 times. The jumhur, the majority will not listen to this because the khas is qat'i and we do not really open it. But there are some instances of that kind. The Quran, of course, as we later explained, consists of the literal in majazi, metaphorical, the mutlaq, absolute, and the muqayyad, qualified. Generally speaking, the literal is likely to be qat'i, and the metaphorical is likely to be zwanni. The mutlaq, the absolute, is likely to be zwanni, and so on. But these will be explained as we proceed in different parts of our lectures. Another aspect of the Qur'anic legislation is brevity and detail, al-ijmal wal-tafsil. Broadly speaking, the Qur'an is devoted to an exposition of the general principles of law, belief, dogma in religion, the basic principles of morality, spirituality and faith. This is the main purpose. The Qur'an delivers and addresses these principles in a general manner. But it does also speak in a specific language. It provides details in certain areas that requires certainty, specificity. In certain parts, as we mentioned, the Qur'an speaks very specifically on matters of belief, inheritance and so on, marriage, divorce, because they require that kind of approach. Abu Zahra, a prominent scholar of 20th century, concurs with Ibn Hazm in saying that virtually every chapter of Islamic jurisprudence and fiqh takes its origin from the Qur'an. Another characterization was made by Al-Shatibi, who has gone on record to say that every scholar in alim who has approached in the Qur'an over research or inquiry on a subject has found something, some kind of guidance relating to his concern. The scholars have characterized the Qur'an that it is comprehensive, it provides guidance on general principles and themes that then may be related to specific subjects. But the text itself also declares, مَا فَرَّطْنَا فِي الْكِتَابِ مِنْ شَيْءٍ. We have neglected nothing in the book. In another place, الْيَوْمُ أَكْمَلْتُ لَكُمْ دِينَكُمْ. Today, this day, I perfected your religion. With reference to the first مَا فَرَّطْنَا, we left nothing in the book. Ulama say that it meant ru'us al-ahkam, the main headings of and the rulings of Sharia. But yet another interpretation is that مَا فَرَّطْنَا فِي الْكِتَابِ مِنْ شَيْءٍ is not a reference to this kitab, this Qur'an, but to the Lawh al-Mahfuz. That is the reference. We neglected nothing. We have interpretations that in the second verse that we perfected to you your religion. That is the subject. That is the main theme of the Qur'an in reference to Aqidah, faith, religion and worship. The Qur'an is self-contained. But it does require a lot of interpretation. The language of the Qur'an is not a facile and easy language. In every generation there are literally hundreds of interpretations attempted over time. For example, the subject we are explaining, Usul al-Fiqh, Islamic Jurisprudence, it is said that only one verse of the Qur'an in Surah 4 verse 59 actually spells out the broad headings of the whole science of Usul al-Fiqh. The ghaibiyat in ibadat, ghaibiyat, those matters of concern to the hereafter and those that are not seen by eyewitness, beliefs in worship, these are explained in detail. Whereas muamalat and so on, these are sometimes addressed more generally and briefly, and they are open to ijtihad in interpretation. The ahkam of the Qur'an, the legal rulings of the Qur'an on certain subjects are very broad, even in the area of law. Concerning contracts, there are a few ayat One, يا أيها الذين آمنوا أوفوا بالعقود, fulfill your contracts, O believers. In one or two other verses, it is emphatically conveyed you must fulfill your promises, and that you must render the trust faithfully to those entitled to that, and to addul amanati ila ahliha. And in another verse addressing the believers, la ta'kulu amwalakum bainakum bil batil, devour not each other's property wrongfully. This is about all you read, the general instruction about contracts, but contract is a huge area of the fiqh. There may be other instructions, but you can see that the Qur'an, the language is very broad, very general, does not really concern itself with a lot of detail. These are provided through relevant evidence in the Sunnah, through ijtihad and so on. On the subject of punishment, we have a few verses. The punishment of an evil is an evil like it. The punishment must be equivalent to the conduct. If you decide to punish, then punish equivalent to the pain inflicted on you. These are the kind of broad principles of crime and punishment. On international law, in our dealing with non-Muslims, there are some references, but the basic principle is in 68, Surah 60, verse 8, La yanhakumullahu. Allah does not forbid you to be good and just to non-Muslims who have not been aggressive towards you. Good relations and just manner of conduct is the principal approach in our relation with other people and nation. On the matters of even ibadat, the matters of worship, salat and zakat and hajj, there are in the Qur'an very broad reference saying that perform the salat and give the zakat, but it does not give any details. The Prophet then provide Sallu kama ra'aytumuni usalli, pray the way you see me, and do the hajj as you see me doing it, and so on. And there are a lot of other details, of course. They are not given in the Qur'an. On government, consultation, justice, equality, but that is the extent of the Qur'ānic manner of brevity in detail, al-ijmal wal-tafsil, detail where it is required, and otherwise the Qur'an tends to be broad and general. One other aspect of the Qur'anic legislation is the phenomena of ta'leel, that is ratiocination, and the cause and effect relation. But this is not the cause and effect we are talking about here as we find in scientific context. And this is the ratio legis, the rationale of a hukum, the rationale of a ruling of the Qur'an, often referred to as illah. Ta'leel means a search for causes, for the proper cause and rationale of the ruling of the Qur'an. It is important to know what is the rationale of a ruling. If we were to be able to extend the spirit and logic of that ruling to similar cases, that is the essence of ijtihad, and that is the way through analogy we extend the wisdom of the Qur'an to other areas. This is known as illah, sometimes also referred to as hikmah or the wisdom. Illah is distinguished from another Arabic word, sabab. Sabab also means a cause, but it is used in reference to something that is not rational. like the ibadat. These are not, we cannot understand all the worship matters rationally. So the cause of performing, observing fast is the arrival of the month of Ramadan. This is the sabab of fasting. But it is the illah of the prohibition of wine drinking is intoxication. We can understand that. Wine is prohibited because it intoxicates. That is the illah, the relationship of this with the hukum is rational, understandable. Also, sabab is the intermediate cause, illah is the immediate. If you, for example, tell your employee, you are dismissed, your words are the illah of the dismissal. But if you say you are dismissed if you leave this building, now if he actually walks out, that becomes the immediate cause, and your words the intermediate, sabab. One becomes sabab, the other becomes illah. Okay. This discussion of the phenomena of ta'leel, ratiocination in the Qur'an has aroused a great deal of controversy among the ulama. The majority accept it. They say that the search for illah in rationale is essential for ijtihad in comprehensive understanding of the Qur'an. Whereas the Zahiris and some others, they say that it is the preoccupation of the weak and the afflicted to search for the causes. The essence of submission is faith. You take the will of Allah as you find it in the Qur'an without asking questions. What is the reason behind it and what is not? What if you cannot find the reason? Will you not then submit? But having said this, it is very clear the Qur'an itself in many places refers to its illah, to the rationale of its ruling, to the benefit or harm of its ruling. With regard to qisas, in qisas there is life for you people who understand. وَلَكُمْ فِي الْقِسَاسِ حَيَاتٌ. In charities, in zakat, so that the wealth does not concentrate only in the hands of the rich. That is the illah of those charities. Lower your gaze to members of the opposite sexes. This is good for your character, and so on and so forth. Many examples. Even in the matters of ibadat, the Qur'an often gives inna salata tanha anil fahsha'i wal munkar. The prayer acts like a barrier between you and evil conduct. The same, the benefits of fasting and so on are explained, and this gives green light to the scholar in the mujtahid how to conduct research in the areas, the rulings in the ahkam of the Qur'an. Without identifying the rationale and illah, it's not possible to construct analogy or even ijtihad, which is almost totally a rational concept. Sometimes, for example, the rulings of the Qur'an may have more than one illah, more than one cause, and it is often not self-evident to identify this. Like earlier I said that the expiation of an oath broken, a false oath, is to feed 10 poor persons. Now, what is the illah of this? Is it to help the poor? Is it to punish the rich? Is it to facilitate fair distribution of assets and properties in foods in society? You can go on and identify more than one effective cause and rationale for the same ruling. But to do that, the Jumhur, the majority, says it is not only advisable but necessary. We may differ, but that is the subject for the Mujtahid and there are methodologies for identification of the correct illah, in that we will be explaining in the context, for example, of analogy and qiyas. Paying attention to the rationale of the hukum of the Qur'an and Sunnah also facilitate better understanding. If you explain the grounds, of course you can absorb the meaning better. It is generally said neither the Qur'an nor the Sharia of Islam is not a kind of playing with words. It's not harfi, letter for letter, for example. They all follow purposes, some kind of logic and rationale. If someone, for example, performs a prayer merely for purposes of hypocrisy and show off, that salat counts for nothing, because the meaning of salat is something else, submission and the spirit of worship. If that is absent, the rationale is absent, the act itself means nothing. I now move on to another aspects of the Qur'an. It's a characteristic aspects of the Qur'an generally, within and outside the area of the ahkam. This is the ijaz of the Qur'an, inimitability of the Qur'an. The Qur'an is believed by Muslim, it is a miracle of the prophethood of Muhammad, the proof of his mission. It is a part of our faith and belief. But what is a miracle? How do you define it, and how the Qur'an qualifies as miraculous, inimitable? Well, different answers are given, but inimitability or ijaz of the Qur'an is explained in 4 ways. It has 4 manifestations. First is the linguistic excellence of the Qur'an. It is by common consensus acknowledged that in the history of the Arab, the linguistic standards of the Qur'an excelled. It is neither prose nor poetry, and does not fit the common kind of recognized genres of literature either. It's characteristics of its own. It was revealed to an illiterate prophet, Nabiyyun Ummiyun, who was incapable of delivering a linguistic artifact of that standing. But the inimitability of the Qur'an, apart from this linguistic excellence, it is a composite phenomena. It is the overall effect of both the meaning, wording, the psychological effect. Ijaz is manifested not just in the language, but the overall, the kind of the self-knowing knowledge of the tone of the Qur'anic language. The second aspect of inimitable inimitability of the Qur'an is references to bygone incidents and historical episodes that generally were made accurately. Despite the time in history at that time, there were no records of the kind. The third feature of ijaz in the Qur'an is accurate forecasting and prediction of future events, like the conquest, the victory of Badr, the conquest of Makka, the initial defeat of the Persians by the Romans, but then the Qur'an says within a few years it will reverse, and it did. The fourth aspect of Ijaz is this scientific aspect, the creation of man from a tissue to different stages, as explained in the text and I have quoted. And that the heaven and the earth, they were together at one time and they were split from one another. That life originates in water. That the winds are carriers and fertilizers of plants and seeds. And even beyond that, the scientific sort of aspects of the Qur'an, there were no, scientific tools to deliver these messages. Yet the Qur'an delivered them accurately. But even more, perhaps so, some of the reforms that the Qur'an brought: equality, injustice, consultation, fair treatment, and the cultural and civilizational kind of content that are found in the Qur'an at a time of history that humanity was beset with dark practices in area of transactions and exploitations and so on. The doctrine of istikhlaf, the vicegerency, principles of government, those are aspects of inimitability of the Qur'an. And lastly, one other characteristic, and quite an important characteristic feature of the Qur'an, is the phenomena of asbab al-nuzul, the occasions of revelation of the Qur'an. This is the phenomenology of the Qur'an. A great deal of the Qur'an, especially in the area of the legal ahkam, were revealed in the context of actual life situations. Problems arose in the Qur'anic verses revealed to the Prophet to address that. This is the asbab al-nuzul, the occasions of the revelation of the Qur'an. The knowledge of the asbab al-nuzul conveyed to us mainly by the companions, and we apply certain criteria. We only accept it if the person was present at the time. And the authenticity of the reports that are given to us is also subject to the same criteria as we apply to the authenticity of hadith. The knowledge of the asbab al-nuzul, occasions of revelation, is very helpful, necessary for a faqih, for a jurist, to not only know the text of the Qur'an, but the context. Sometimes the context is so important that you need to only take the kind of only an elusive aspect of the text and give that prominence over the major other part of the text, because that was the context. And then knowledge, if you ignore the knowledge of this phenomenology of the Qur'an, you are likely to run into conflict and problem. There was a discussion arose between Umar al-Khattab and Abdullah ibn Abbas. And Ibn Abbas was right, telling the Sayyidina Umar that we witness the phenomena as asbab al-nuzul. We know it and we can understand the Qur'an, but the Qur'an is not an easy text. Generations down the line, people would understand it differently. And it did so happen. We know that some of the references in the Qur'an, some of the texts only refer to the disbelievers. People thought it applies to everyone. Some texts were only referring to the deceased people. People thought it was only, those were only understood from the context and not necessarily always clear in the text. The Arab of the time, the customary context and knowledge of and the social practices of Arab society. That is what is conveyed in the knowledge of Asbab al-Nuzul. This is also an aspect that is often not given its due prominence. And this is a subject some scholars like Fazlur Rahman, he emphasizes that if you want to recapture the original meaning of a great deal of the Qur'an that over the centuries has been really become so much subjected to details and tafsir upon tafsir, that we almost huge gap develops between us in the text. We are sometimes told, don't read the Qur'an without reading the tafsir, without reading the sunnah, then a distance develops over time. To recapture that, you must make that an integral part of the understanding of the Qur'an. Thank you.